Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Peter Beinart, non-resident fellow at FMEP. Today is March 12th, 2024, and I'm delighted to be here with Ahmed Moor, Palestinian-American writer who was born and raised in Gaza. He is co-editor of the book After Zionism, One State for Israel Palestine. Ahmed, you wrote a very powerful piece that I would really recommend folks read in the Boston Review called "We Are Not From Where We Are From." And I just want to read the kind of ending of it as a preface to my question. You write, um, uh, in February, I learned that the last remnant of the Abu Moor farm in Gaza, where my father was born, has now been subsumed by a 1 kilometer buffer zone, a literal no man's land that Israel has drawn in the Strip. Families displaced from northern Gaza, including my own, wonder if they will be permitted to return. Those who have been killed by the Israelis, my cousins and their children, and 30 to 40,000 other humans decompose in Gaza's soil or under the rubble, where their corpses degrade without dignity, Israelis dance. History reveals much. To be Palestinian is to lay claim to a vast wasteland, yet we are not alone. Israel will continue to be buffeted by the force of moral illegitimacy and isolation. The genocide in Gaza has forged that guarantee in blood. So you and I were just speaking a minute ago about the difficulty of imagining what comes after this, and in particular, imagining how Israelis and Jews, Israelis and Palestinians, sorry, how Israelis and Palestinians could live together after this, in the kind of conditions of equality and justice that you have written about in your book. And I'd love you just to talk about how you think about that in this moment.
Yeah, thanks for the prompt, Peter, and glad to be engaging this conversation with you, which I think, in a kind of meta sense, informs that question of what comes afterwards. Because you do need to have these kinds of conversations in order to humanize the other, and we're a long way from going back to where we were before the genocide. Um, but if I pause for a moment and think about what animates my opposition to Zionism and why I care so deeply about this issue. If I forget for a moment that, yes, I'm Palestinian, yes, I was born in Gaza, I have family there. Um, it is about human rights, and it's about this question of how do we ensure that the children who do survive in Gaza and everywhere in that country lead a better life than what preceded uh, um, their generation. And what's so heartbreaking for me about what's happening now, that Boston Review piece, my dad's 73 now, and he was recounting these stories when he was 5 years old, and the massacre, which was documented by Joe Sacco in 1956. That seemed like ancient history the first time I'd heard that. Of course, we know about Cast Lead, we know about 2014, but that kind of unbridled, call it martial tactic. I don't want to be hyperbolic in my language, where men are rounded up and executed summarily. That felt to me like an artifact of a bygone era, and to observe, no, these things continue to happen. They continue to happen in the open, and they continue to happen with the full sanction of a society. Uh, is hard to process. And that point about the full support of the Israeli society for what's being done in Gaza, the genocide, um, that's hard to contend with. I don't know how we come back from this. I don't know. But the starting point for me is the survivors, the children who survive, need to have a better outcome. They need to have a better life. And that animates everything else. That's the principle, and really the only priority, bigger than a desire for some abstract justice, a desire for peace, whatever that may mean. And I've never really believed in peace as such. It needs to be justice, which is going to yield a condition of peace. Um, Peace is an outcome. It's not the the goal necessarily, I would say. And so what does it mean to provide an environment in which these kids can be safe and secure? That's the principal question. And if that means that we need to find a way to recover as a people from this genocide, because nobody's going anywhere. The Israelis aren't going anywhere, and the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. Well, then that's what we have to do. We have to recover for the future. And it's hard to say, and it's hard to think about now. I don't know who's going to survive. But it's if I step outside myself for a moment, that's the animating principle. That's the idea. How do we save people?
I mean, I guess, is it really beyond just beyond demanding a ceasefire so that the people, so that Israel stops killing Palestinians in Gaza? Is it yet possible to start to think about what what Palestinians want after the war ends? Because it seems to me so much of the discourse about what happens after the war ends is dictated by things we're hearing from Israel. You wrote about this, making Gaza even smaller, or bringing in some, or Biden administration stuff, which seems to be kind of bringing in some Arab force. It doesn't seem to be a discourse in which Palestinian voices are really being heard. It's either kind of Israeli voices or kind of American voices. Is it possible to start having that conversation, or does this not conversation just need to wait until the killing stops?
Well, so you're right. The urgent question is ceasefire, full stop. None of this silliness about a humanitarian pause and 6 weeks of what, and then recover or return to the slaughter. What does that mean practically? It's not a moral position to take, and it's not a meaningful position to take. And if I were in a position to negotiate, I'd say this is silliness. This doesn't make any sense. Either a ceasefire or nothing at all, right? Um, what comes the day after? The reason we haven't heard Palestinian voices, I think, is a good reflection of the structural reality of the situation, in which Palestinians, unless they're really participating in an armed resistance, are voiceless, right? I mean, Hamas engaged in reprehensible acts, full stop. Hamas engaged in terrorism, full stop. Hamas is also a political movement. Before Hamas perpetrated the war crimes that were perpetrated on October 7th, the Palestinians had basically been locked out of the conversation. And so there's a clear message there, right? We don't want you when you're Pacific. We don't want you when you're behaving nicely according to our kind of imperially oriented parameters. And when you behave badly, we have to listen to you because we don't like it, but we have to listen to you. And that's what Hamas has demonstrated really effectively. So what happens the day after? There aren't Palestinians being incorporated into that discussion because Palestinians don't matter, frankly, unless they engage in acts that I was hoping we'd never see again. Um, if Palestinian voices are being considered and are able to participate in the conversation meaningfully, I think the first thing the Palestinians need is protection from Israel. Israel has demonstrated a total, and again, I want to avoid hyperbole here, but a total, call it disregard for Palestinian life, which is manifested in the most brutal ways, uh, shockingly brutal ways. I would say that nothing in the history of Israel would have led me to predict the scale of what's being perpetrated today in Gaza. And I mean scale. We've seen similar acts in the past, but the scale is just astonishing. Um, the first principle, the day after, the Palestinians need protection from Israel. This is a a country which is being run by people which is full of people who seem to regard us as vermin which need to be exterminated, and the Palestinians need protection, full stop.
And what given that Palestinians don't have a state, which is the entity that protects people, is supposed to protect people, what other options are there? Are we talking about some kind of international force in Gaza, in the West Bank as well, where Palestinians are also extremely vulnerable? Do you have any idea of what that might look like?
So this is where my imagination fails. Uh, I don't know. There isn't anybody out there who can protect the Palestinians from the Israelis. The Western governments are complicit. The United States is actively participating. And I think that became clear through Airman Bushnell's self-immolation, right? I mean, we learned that the U.S. Air Force is participating in direct support to the Israeli Air Force, providing direct support rather. So it goes beyond the provision of weaponry and the veto at the UN. Um, are Germans going to protect the Palestinians from the Israelis? You know, the Russians aren't. I don't see the Chinese stepping into the breach. And so the question of where the genocide ends really becomes almost moot. It at this point, I feel like I'm out of ideas and out of optimism, and I believe that there's not very much will to prevent. So you're talking about the genocide really changing form after a ceasefire. I don't see anything meaningful happen to achieve that protection um, in the way that the Palestinians deserve. That there's no fundamental change in the geopolitical constellation of things underfoot that would yield a better outcome for the Palestinians. Maybe a ceasefire will happen, and then the ethnic cleansing continues in much the way that it has in the past, um, however many years. It's certainly accelerated in the past 20 years.
Right, because even if Israel wasn't killing Palestinians directly, right, if Gaza remains unlivable, there's no food, there's no hospitals, there's no functioning economy, it's still a form of death, right? I mean, it's that as you say, would just continue even after the shooting stop.
100%. And in fact, there's nothing to give us optimism. There's no reason to believe that facts on the ground are going to change. We may be in the lamentable position of saying, my goodness, what happened in 30 years? And revisiting this, really dark period that we're in from a historical perspective and erecting, if you go to the killing fields in Cambodia, you'll see these massive heaps of human skulls and bones, and you go, holy shit, excuse me, but how did this happen? Um, you know, that may be where we end up here. I don't see the Palestinians achieving the kind of protection they need from the Israelis. Certainly a few solar panel arrays in the West Bank funded by the EU aren't going to achieve it.
You I said, and I would of course agree that what Hamas did was a war crime and immoral, killing civilians. I gather though that I think Hamas, to the degree that Hamas is not denying what it did, maybe its supporters would say, um, uh, we have what we have done, again, even though you and I consider it fundamentally immoral, has put the Palestinians in a better place than they were, because even though Israel kind of retaliated in this overwhelmingly massive kind of acts of violence, it's put the Palestinian question on the front stage in the world, and it's not being ignored like it was on October 6th. So I'm wondering if you think that claim is true, that this massacre that happened on October 7th essentially put Palestinians in a stronger position politically than they had been before, because at least basically the world is paying attention.
I struggle with the premise, and I'll explain why. I mean, I want to be very clear. Armed resistance, when you're occupied, is a right that people have. People have a right to resist their occupation, ethically, I would say, through armed resistance. And that the emphasis on the word ethically. What does that resist? What form does that armed resistance take? What does it look like? And we've seen abundant history illustrating what resistance against an occupying army can look like, in France and other places. And we've also seen terrorism used by, we had this conversation in November, by the Yishuv, by the occupied French, by the
Yeah.
Algerians, by other
Yes.
groups of people.
Yes.
We've seen terrorism being used to
Yes.
great political effect.
Yes.
What I am uncomfortable with and what I am unwilling to do is to say that a child lost his or her life in order for me to have more political leverage. Uh, I I I'm not willing to say to the Palestinians in Gaza, "Hey, don't flee into Egypt because you're going to relinquish our political claim." So my need to have a fact on the ground supersedes your right to life. That's not how it works. That's not how it should work. And so I struggle with that argument that, where we're at today, certainly, I think the mask has come off. I've never had any illusions about Israel. I know that place intimately. I've interacted with right-wing Zionists for most of my life and left-wing Zionists. Um, what shocked me here is the scale, but not the form of what's occurring. Uh, yes, it's great to see on one level that much of the world, which is humane and right thinking, had observed what's happening and said, this is wrong. And oh my goodness, we weren't aware Israel was like this. Great. Am I willing to sacrifice a single child's life or a single innocent person's life in pursuit of that argument or that goal? No. Um, revolutionary leaders, Mao and other people, they you read these statements and you read the history of the Korean War and those kinds of things, and yes, people were sacrificed for political outcomes. Um, I'm not comfortable with that.
Mhm. I've heard people talk about the reconstituting or reviving of the PLO as a legitimate body that would allow Palestinians to kind of offer a vision of what they want, given that there was this historic decision to embrace partition in 1988, but many people, including you, have said it's now a dead letter. I wonder I know that faces a lot of obstacles. What do you think it would take to revive the PLO and basically make it a body that could allow Palestinians to offer a vision of kind of what their freedom struggle looks like in this moment?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, the earlier question we were talking about, having a seat at the table when the structural deck is stacked against you, is distinct from having a cohesive, clearly articulated set of national priorities and a vision for the future. And I do think that Hamas needs to be Hamas and Hamas-like groups, right? In that piece that you cited, the opening in the Boston Review, the Fedaiyin used to be the bad guys.
Right.
That's what the massacre of
Yes.
1956.
Yes.
There's
And
always
the
going to be
PLO.
armed resistance. Exactly, the PLO. There's always going to be armed resistance to Israel. All of those groups need to be incorporated in the Palestinian body politic, as you would have in any ordinary functioning society. You have a spectrum of groups, and they need to be able to have conversations, not all of them friendly, about what the national direction is. And so, yes, with respect to all of the kind of big brain prognosticators in Washington, Hamas has to be a part of the solution here. And I use the word solution probably incorrectly. Has to be a part of the extension of the PLO, the Palestinian articulation of what it means to survive as a national group.
Yeah. And when you look in the United States at the Palestine solidarity movement, that I know you know intimately, I guess what strikes me about it is that something I think culturally has changed in the United States, certainly in kind of progressive or even liberal circles. This issue has a greater salience. It's something that many people now feel very, very passionately about from a whole wide variety of backgrounds. And yet, when I look at at Washington and American kind of electoral politics, yes, there's some Democrats now who are talking about conditioning aid, but I don't see the Democrats who support this war, like John Fetterman, your senator. I don't see them quaking in their boots, in terms of whether they can hold on to the jobs. To the contrary, I worried about Jamal Bowman and Summer Lee holding on to their because the political power in Washington seems, irrespective of this mass movement and this shift in public opinion and in public culture, still seems so powerful. And I wonder if you see if you think it is possible that this movement, this shift culturally in the public, will make its way into actual politics and shift U.S. Actual government policy.
I'm hopeful that it will. But I'm also mindful that there's a lack of harmony between the electoral process and the urgent need for policy change. And the effort of harmonizing those things is impossibly difficult during a crisis. I do think that we're experiencing kind of mass trauma as a media addicted society, where so many young people, particularly, are viewing
Yes.
shocking violence in real time. I've used the word shocking, 4 or 5 times now, but I think that's the main that's how I would describe this whole experience. Um, and so then how does that trauma inform political process? I don't know yet. It takes years, I think, to build the democratic structures and processes and agendas, the quorum, the movement, incorporating it into bylaws of labor movements, and then ultimately impacting electoral change. I I guess that's where a lot of my pessimism draws from. But if you want to take a positive outlook on the future, it is linked to the upswell of kind of democratic sentiment, and I mean across the board, small d, democratic sentiment that the United States is acting out of concert with its values as a country, that the majority of people in this country want to see a more even-handed approach, and are aware of our active participation in something which is morally reprehensible. John Fetterman, and I'm guessing here, is probably a one-term senator, given his personal issues. 6 years is a lifetime in politics. I don't think people will forget. But Israel still has a lot of latitude to correct within the zone of I'm going to ignore that issue for the average American voter. Israel can become 40% less brutal and will suddenly no longer be front page news. And we may see more or less business as usual for the next 10 years, 20 years. What is encouraging, though, is that for the first time, you're hearing people talk about conditioning aid. The topic, you can accuse a man of being a thief, and he may have nothing to do with burglary, but by having introduced the topic, you cast doubt on his character. I think we can introduce the topic to be extremely, maybe it's not the right frame, but we can introduce the topic of conditioning aid to Israel, cutting off arms to Israel, and now suddenly it's being talked about at the highest levels of this government, even as a non-starter, but it's being talked about, and suddenly the idea has been introduced. If you want to take a more optimistic view, you can say that yes, maybe in the 10, 15-year term, we'll see a realignment in the party apparatus where the Democratic Party becomes actively opposed to apartheid. My question is just what happens in the interim. How many people are going to be killed? The democratic process just can't match the urgency of the moment.
Yes. Yes. I mean, this seems to me one of the most fundamental questions, which is that, as you said, that there are many people in Israel in positions of authority in Israel who I think their vision for how they want to solve this problem for them is to basically reduce the Palestinian population through expulsion or even death, in the way that the United States did in the 19th century, right? That was, we didn't give Native Americans their own country. And I, it's such a kind of, it's such an ugly question even to ask, but the question is it possible in today's world? When you talk about, with the Arab countries allow it to happen, you're talking about a 10 to 15 year shift in the United States. If we have a government like this in Israel in 10 to 15 years, as you're implying, what's going to be left, right? So I don't know whether you think that this notion of basically of mass expulsion and reduction of the Palestinian population could actually happen, or basically if in today's realities that's simply not possible to do what was possible in the 19th century.
So I used to joke that I used to say Israel's anachronistic. I'm sure you've heard this from other people.
Yes.
Israel's an anachronism. Would have been much more successful in the 18th century, or 19th century possibly than the 20th century. You could expel the natives, you could keep all the pretty homes and some of the artwork, and write big books about how sorry you are, and that's kind of how it was done in Australia, New Zealand, the United States. So Israel's anachronistic. I would have said no. There's no way that in the 21st century Israel could pursue that kind of program. But everything I thought about the scale of brutality, one, that Israelis are capable of, and two, that the world would be able to tolerate or willing to tolerate, has been fundamentally wrong. And the past 5 months have been a big, have been an education in that regard. Can the Israelis do it? Yes, I think they can. Are the Arabs going to act against Israel? No, I don't believe they will. Europe, I don't believe Europe will act against Israel. The United States is now engaging in the most cynical, comical, black comedy of arming the Israelis and then building this bridge to nowhere out in the ocean, this pier, as a way of frankly, let me be cynical for a moment, fooling an electorate which wants to look away. And I don't think that's how people really are. I don't think the electorate wants to look away, but I think that's perception in Washington, that this is a PR challenge, not a real humanitarian or moral challenge. So yeah, I think the Israelis could get away with it. I do. I think if anything, the Europeans were fairly impotent in most regards, may issue more visas to allow Palestinians to escape. Uh, Great.
Mm. You mentioned that you thought the Biden administration was trying to get people to look away, but that it wouldn't work. I mean, do you think at this point there is anything the Biden administration could do to get voters who care about this issue, about Palestinian humanity, Palestinian life, to vote for Joe Biden in November, or has that ship sailed?
Yeah, I think that warship is sitting, 100 nautical miles off the coast of Gaza. It's long gone.
Mhm.
Uh, no, there's nothing they can do. But I think so. I was speaking with a smart friend who studies media and Palestinian-American man, and he said, look, the most constructive, the best outcome here is we take a nuanced approach to elections, and vote in a divided government, vote in Democrats who control the Senate or the House, such that the next administration, excuse me, which I don't think is going to be a Cornel West or Jill Stein administration. So the next administration is, stymied in its efforts to pass destructive legislation, if that's what it wants to do. But if you take the more positive view, again, there's so much there's so little which is positive. So we're so limited in taking a positive view. We could view this as the opportunity to reconstruct the Democratic Party away from total fidelity to a client state, to something which is more moral, and consistent with our values as human beings and Americans, ultimately. Um, and to kind of evoke Condoleezza Rice, the birth pangs of the new Middle East during the Iraq War, we may be on the cusp of the birth pangs of the new United States or the new Democratic Party through this election. That would be okay.
And what do you say? I'm sure you've heard this many, many times to people who say, yes, I agree with everything you say about what the Biden administration has done in Gaza and the utter profound immorality of its active participation in the destruction of an entire society. But I have to vote for Joe Biden because American democracy is on the line. And even if we elected a Democratic Congress, if we have Trump in there, I don't know that there are going to be free elections in the future to get him out.
Yeah. So one comment there is structural. I think American democracy is much more resilient than people give it credit for. At least our institutions are more resilient than people give them credit for. This is a country of 350 or 60 million people.
Mhm.
It's a big, complex place with lots of competing interests. This is not Belarus.
Mhm.
So I'm not sure I buy the end of democracy argument. I think certainly institutionally we'll suffer. Um, this country's gone through a real civil war. It's more resilient than people believe, I think. Um, but the second piece, is bodily autonomy, abortion rights, is that more important than genocide? Is climate more important than genocide? What is climate in service of anyway?
Mhm.
The humans who inhabit the earth. Well, if we're going to kill all the people on earth, what's the point of, preventing climate change? Uh, there's no issue which supersedes in importance, to my mind, and in terms of values, the genocide that's currently unfolding. And if people resist the idea of single issue voters, and you see this come up in the New York Times constantly, I believe at core everybody's a single issue voter. And then the question becomes, what is your issue? Well, my issue is abortion rights. Therefore, I'm voting for Biden. Or my issue is climate. Therefore, I'm voting for the Democrat. My issue is Ukraine. Therefore, I'm voting for the Democrat. Or enhanced benefits for low-income people. Therefore, I'm voting for the Democrat. If we were just going to triangulate by or write a program to assign the highest expected value across a range of weighted policies, well then what's the point of voting? Just let a computer do it. It can do it with a higher degree of fidelity than you or me. And that's not how democracy works.
Mhm. The last question I wanted to ask you was about the interactions between Jews and Palestinians in this Palestine solidarity movement. I know this is something you've thought about. You've been very involved in yourself. It seems to me there's on this alliance um, seems to me on the one hand is very important, and yet I wonder about the challenges that it produces. On the one hand, it seems to me there's a way in which sometimes Jews are pushed to the front or go into the front because they're considered to have more protection, frankly, protection from being called anti-Semitic, or maybe just protection from being jailed, beaten up, arrested, whatever. They're using their privilege in America. And yet that also seems to me to have the danger of replicating a kind of privilege that itself is the problem, right? Is that there's no reason whatsoever that a Jewish person should have a greater status in this conversation than a Palestinian person, or frankly, than anyone else, seems to me. So I'm curious how you think about how to manage that and think about that in the context of this movement.
So I think so I 100% agree with you. But I do think there's a qualitative difference often in the experiences that Palestinians in the Palestine Solidarity and other Arabs, Christian, Muslim, whatever Arabs experience, and that of my Jewish friends who are in the movement. We often don't contend with a generational gap and
Mhm.
the experience of being isolated from our families around a
Yeah.
policy disagreement. And that feature of call it casting off Zionism for Jewish Americans
Mhm.
in the way that I've seen it is particularly interesting and it's
Mhm.
powerful.
Mhm.
It's somebody who is observing somebody who's willing to stand alone and away from a group, to rethink
Mhm.
decades of indoctrination in some cases, or education, depending on your point of view, to say, no, I'm standing up for independent principles. I've never had to make that
Mhm.
claim.
Mhm.
I was born into a point of view, into a movement, um, that more or less accords with what I think is an ethical point of view, now as an adult. So I've never had to. So I think that's a fundamentally interesting phenomenon that
Yeah.
deserves attention.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the film Israelism yet, but I think that's mostly what it gets into. And I've seen, the clips that you've highlighted. I'm sorry, that you've participated
Yeah.
in. So that qualitative difference, I think that there should be attention paid to that. What is the
Mhm.
process of John Kerry, leaving the military and testifying in Congress and saying, wait, this is wrong. So that insider's view is important.
Mhm.
Um, but the privileging of Jewish voices over Palestinian voices, I think some of this, if I had to guess, I think some of it is a kind of newness to America. At one point, Jewish immigrants were the outsiders, and Palestinian and other Arab immigrants are more recent arrivals. And you kind of take your licks and you earn your seat at the table in the way that American democracy works.
Yeah.
And that means that the WASPs have had to make room, and today that means that primarily Ashkenazi Jews have to make room, and not just for Palestinian voices, but a host of other
Right.
new groups who are entering a kind of more mainstream awareness in our society. Um, but I do want to say that this kind of Jewish Palestinian alliance is sometimes regarded as being more special than it is at the individual level.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like individually, we're just people who are working in concert to affect some change
Mhm.
together and struggling with some issues together. There's nothing that special about it. It's just a
Yeah.
lot of, in my experience, good people pulling in the same direction.
Yeah. 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 I think you're right. And I think that the role that people like you play, I think for Jews who get involved in the struggle for Palestinian freedom is really exceptionally important because, as you noticed, if you're forced to some kind of rupture with the community in which you grew up and even your family, it makes you somewhat vulnerable. Even if you may have, in general, maybe a more privileged position in society for various reasons, you kind of are a little bit adrift. And so the people that then you have cast your lot with, you're putting a lot of trust in them in a certain way, right? Especially when the community you're from is basically saying, those are the last people you should trust, right? And I think that's why the kind of the welcome that and not just a welcome on a human level, but a kind of the way in which you have offered a vision of a kind of vision of that embraces all people, and that is not a struggle of one tribe against another, but is a vision which embraces all people because of our common humanity. I think that's what allows people to kind of cross that difficult bridge. It's seeing again and again that the Palestinians they meet don't conform to the stereotypes that they had been taught about. And every time that I think people have that experience, it makes them a little more self-confident, and so anyway, that's something that has really, I will just say, had a very big impact on me over the years.
I'm grateful to you for that comment, and it's mutual. I mean, it really is. Um, yeah, I mean, encountering just good people who are brave enough and able enough to continue to grow and learn, and this is kind of a mutual. It's a conversation, right? It's the building of a solidarity movement, and it relies on trust and it relies on common values. Um, it's the only hope there is for the future for those of us who survive, and I mean on both sides.
Yes, 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 yes. And on that kind of sobering but very honest note, thank you so much, Ahmed, for joining me, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other rich content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And you can also watch videos of our podcast, including this one on YouTube. And with that, I'm Peter Beinart signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.